So for my part of the program, I'm going to be discussing our draft implementation and summary. Not quite sure what the final title of the project will be. It might be the Natchaug Watershed Protection Plan. So that's going to change. As you can see, we've developed a logo for our project. Naturally Natchaug. I want to shout out to Gary Honig, who's now on the call. He's a volunteer who's been working with me and providing great service for helping with the outreach on this project. So I like this logo. It shows the shape of the watershed and the towns that are in the community. Again, as Tracy said, this project has been supported by a 319 grant through the Connecticut DEEP, and we wouldn't be able to do programs like this without that type of funding assistance. So Tracy has gone over briefly before what a watershed plan is. Eastern Connecticut Conservation District has produced multiple watershed plans for impaired waters in the state of Connecticut in the past. This includes a watershed plan we wrote for the lower part of the Natchaug River below the Willimantic Reservoir because there were high amounts of pathogens in the water. We tracked them down and we wrote recommendations, and those recommendations are in the process of being implemented as funding allows. So there's different types of impairments. It might be excess nutrients, high level of pathogens, or aquatic habitat quality, stream flow interruptions, or high amounts of impervious cover. This is a different kind of watershed plan because the rivers are in general in good shape. They're not pristine, but they're in general very good shape. So a healthy watershed plan is supposed to be a strategy to protect water and habitat that's not terribly degraded and to keep it healthy for both people and nature. It's by the EPA's directive, it's supposed to be a cost-effective, non-regulatory approach to achieve these goals. And I've tried to stick to that as much as I could. So as DEEP has presented their recommendations, I'm going to go into a lot more detail with focus goals and strategies that we want to use to address stressors in the watershed. I will start out by saying that above the Willimantic Reservoir, which is about between 64 and 70 square miles, the area above that drains into the Willimantic Reservoir by state statute is Class AA water. And what that means is there are specific designated uses for that water. So it is an existing drinking water supply. So all the water that drains off the watershed above the Willimantic Reservoir eventually goes through the Willimantic Reservoir. While it's doing that, it could also be habitat for fish and other aquatic life and used by other wildlife. That's permitted. Recreation is permitted, but it may be restricted. And I'll give you two examples of recreational activities that are restricted in this watershed. Mansfield Hollow Lake is within 2 miles of that drinking water intake. Therefore, public bathing beaches are not permitted. It's not that the water isn't safe for swimming in, it's just being protected as a drinking water supply, and we don't want to have opportunities to introduce human pathogens that close to the intake for the drinking water supply. You also cannot land your pontoon plane on Mansfield Hollow Lake. In case you had an inkling that you wanted to do that, it's against the health codes. You can use water from the river for industrial uses. You can use it for agriculture, but this is the one thing that's different. You are not allowed to discharge wastewater into any streams above the Willimantic Reservoir. So that is a little bit of a hindrance on development upstream because you can't have a sewage treatment plant that discharges its effluent into any of the streams. And industrial processes have to be able to be served by on-site wastewater disposal systems that don't discharge into streams as well. But that regulation is part of the reason the water is in such good condition. So all the pollution sources in the water are not from point sources like an outlet pipe, a discharge pipe. It's from non-point sources, very diffuse among the watershed. We'll be talking some of those issues. In the state of Connecticut, there's a conservation development policies plan, and the areas that are outlined in those plans are shaded in different colors. You can easily pick out the Natchaug watershed up here in northeastern Connecticut. It is a tan area. That is an area the state wants to serve with conservation practices. So you're not as likely to get any economic development assistance if they want to see this as a conserved area. The plan that we wrote will be compatible with the state's POCD. Beginning of the project, we circulated a survey asking the residents, the stakeholders in the watershed, what they value about this watershed. And those survey results have been reported, tabulated into a report, and that report's available on the Eastern Connecticut Conservation District website. It's a little hard to find, so if anybody wants to read the survey, send me an email and I will send you the link to it. However, the results of the survey overwhelmingly show that people in this area understood that the forest cover is really important for maintaining the watershed health. They also understood that those strips of land adjacent to rivers, those riparian buffer areas, are very important for protecting stream health. They also understood that recreational values of this watershed are very good for the local community for multiple reasons. And they appreciated that the water that drained off their land was supplying water for people to drink in Willimantic and parts of Mansfield, and that downstream drinking water quality was important to them as well. Stormwater runoff was understood to be an important issue. Water temperature and its impact on aquatic life habitat was also important. And looking around and seeing the biodiversity is a good indicator of watershed health. So it was great that this population in the area appreciates the natural resources they have at their disposal, and some people may take for granted. These people in the survey didn't. So with forests are very important, and that's a big part of why we have such a healthy watershed. Currently, there's about 74% forest cover in the watershed. That wasn't always the case. The area was pretty much clear cut for agriculture 150 years ago. Forests returned. Those forests provide services to us without charging us anything. They encourage stormwater to soak into the ground. They prevent erosion, and they reduce the cost of downstream water treatment. There's a very famous case study in the city of New York. They were faced with putting in a super expensive water treatment plant, and they were looking for ways to save money, and rather than putting in infrastructure to treat water and filter it at the end of the pipe. And they looked to the watershed where their water came from. And they came to the conclusion it would be like 1/6 the cost to conserve land upstream of their drinking water intake than it would be to filter the water if it was allowed to develop. And they were able to do that, and that's why we have the Catskills Reserve Area and parts of the Delaware watershed are protected, because of New York City supporting that conservation, investing in upland conservation rather than downstream infrastructure. And while the forests are doing these wonderful services, they're also providing wildlife habitat, they're protecting aquatic stream habitat quality, and they provide a renewable resource and jobs in the timber and the firewood industry. So if I could say, we have 74% forest, let's increase forest cover by 10%, boom, plan's done, walk away. It'd be easy, but I can't do that. So the next, we can also look at our forests in terms of their size, because size does matter. This was an analysis of forest fragmentation that was done by the Center for Land Use Education and Resources out of UConn. They used aerial imagery to determine where the forests were uninterrupted, and they did this map. The darker the shade of green, the larger that forest block is. And You see interrupting those forest blocks yellow, and I don't think it takes a college degree to figure out that yellow represents where the roads are. So we have fragmentation of these forests, but we still have really good intact forests. And you see areas of white. Those are areas where there aren't forests, like over here in Eastward Woodstock. This valley here has a lot of agriculture. Over here in Mansfield, we see a white area. That's both agriculture and developed land associated with the Stores region of Mansfield. And downstream of Mansfield Hollow Lake and the reservoir is a lot of white. And that's where Route 6 goes through Willimantic and Mansfield, and a lot of development associated with that. And there's a lot of farmland also in this region. Of all those forest areas, this is the amount of forest area that's preserved, or I call quasi-preserved. We have two big state forests in the region. In Eastford and Chaplin and parts of Ashford, we have the Natchaug forest in its various pieces. And then when you go further up in the watershed, we have the Nipmuc forest. And this area in between that's kind of green and purple is the Yale forest. Yale's forest is not preserved, but as long as it's an educational asset to Yale University, they will maintain it as a forest. And then there's scattered land trust properties and municipal properties in between. But you can see that most of the property in the watershed is privately owned. So we have to respect people's private property rights, and we want to work with those people to convince them that they can have their property and still help protect this watershed. So if you can't save all the forests, the next best thing to do is preserve the streamside vegetation. This is a high value resource. It's multifunctional. It acts as a pollution filter. It stabilizes the stream bank. The root systems and the understory plants keep that stream bank from eroding. It filters agricultural and urban runoff as it sheet flows through that area, allowing that runoff to soak into the ground. It helps to moderate stream temperature, especially those smaller headwater streams, if you maintain a tree canopy over the stream. The shade keeps the water from being exposed to the solar exposure. It provides wildlife habitat, and earlier this spring we did a program on the riparian buffers for both their functions and their wildlife habitat uses. And it's recorded if anybody wants to view that. It's especially the part that was done by Patrick Smith. It was wonderful to see the variety of habitat that use these riparian buffers. It's a food resource, not just for the terrestrial wildlife, but the base of the food chain in these headwater stream systems is actually the leaves that fall into the rivers. It protects us against floods. If you don't develop in these areas, you are not putting people's lives or livelihood in danger, and you don't have to rescue them and putting your first responders in danger. And aesthetically, the tree canopy along the stream corridors is much nicer in my opinion. Tracy has already shown this map. It's the riparian buffers. They use a 300-foot wide buffer on each side of the streams in this analysis. Most wetland commissions only review about 100 feet, maybe Mansfield a wider corridor. But these areas are mostly green in the Natchaug, which is also wonderful news. But we do see brown, yellow, and red areas. Those are areas that we can look at focusing on restoring them, working with people to voluntarily replant or intercept runoff that's going into streams along these areas. And there's programs that exist now that are available for people, and they are through the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, working with ag producers, providing funding assistance if they want to widen their buffers. And we can work with landowners and convince them that it's better for everybody if they don't mow their grass to the edge of the water. Our forests provide a large diversity of wildlife, and this was an analysis done by an organization called Nature's Networks. The darker green areas are the highest priority, important lands for conservation for wildlife diversity, and the light green areas are other important habitats. We have a lot of green on this map. This is not true of the entire state of Connecticut. And the brown areas are areas that they have identified that can become connectors. And those connectors, of course, could be along the riparian buffers or through another program I'm going to talk about for protecting pollinators that use those same areas. We can protect water quality and wildlife diversity at the same time. This is your traditional land cover map that we use when we're analyzing watershed health. This is using an aerial flyover and using the reflectivity of how light reflects off surfaces to determine what the land cover is. It's pretty good analysis. So the greens, of course, are our forests. Browns are agriculture. Yellow is grass. Red is impervious cover. And blue is either water or wetlands. So this is what it looks like when you look at that type of map. We could also use that map to look at how land contributes nutrients into the watershed. There was a study that was done by Lee Dunbar and Mary Becker at DEEP back in 2009. They lumped these land cover categories into 3 general groups. So all the forests and the wetlands and water surface water, they lumped into a category they called forests, and they took impervious cover, turf and grass, and barren land, and they referred to that as urban land. And they took the yellow, the agriculture and other grasses, and called that agriculture, which you see in yellow. So this is a better way to demonstrate what those pressures are in terms of phosphorus coming into the watershed. In freshwater environments, phosphorus is typically the nutrient in lowest amount, and as long as we keep low amounts of phosphorus, we're not going to be encouraging algae and plant growth in our water resources. So there is no land cover on this map that shows 0 phosphorus contributions. However, forests have the lowest amount. So we're going to use our forests as our baseline for phosphorus contribution. So for every acre of land, you have 0.0000104 pounds of phosphorus that's being shed off the land daily. And it's not even every day, it's on average, because you have rainy days with more and there's dry days when there's less. Contrast that to urban development, and you have 4 times as much phosphorus running off the land. So you can see already that urban land, and that includes turf and grass, is shedding more phosphorus and has a bigger stressor on the environment. So that urban development is in context to those river corridors. It could be more impactful, or you can remediate it, reduce the threat by interrupting that source through low impact development strategies, or just having riparian buffers in between. And agriculture, of course, is one of the higher contributing sources, 19 times as much as forests. So agriculture in those river valleys is a concern, but I'll say that this analysis was done in 2009. In 2013, Connecticut banned phosphorus in lawn fertilizer. So that those numbers may be higher than current runoff would be. And in agriculture, a lot of the ag producers are adopting no-till strategies and healthy soil strategies. And as they do this, they also reduce the amount of phosphorus in their runoff. We can encourage more farms to participate in those programs and changing how they farm and have less impact. The proximity of these resources to water resources. Here is the Natchaug River. It starts with Still River and Bigelow Brook come together and flows into Mansfield Hollow Lake. And it's pretty noticeable. There's a red line that parallels the Natchaug River. The Mount Hope River, it goes through Mansfield and Ashford, and you also see a red line there. Those red lines represent Route 89 along the Mount Hope and 198 along the Natchaug River. There will be impacts on the hydrology in the watershed from this type of co-location of resources, the road networks close to our rivers. However, it's a lot easier and less expensive to build roads in river valleys, but there's environmental costs. I'm not suggesting we move the highways, but I want it to be thoughtful on where future highways are put in relationship to these important water resources. And of course, the best agricultural lands happen to be in our river valleys. So that's something to be thinking about as well. And reducing impacts from agricultural runoff on our water quality is something we need to be focusing on going forward. This map is just calling out where the impervious cover is. And you can see it's very scattered throughout the watershed, except in two instances. In Mansfield, we have the Stores region near UConn's campus. And down below the Willimantic River Reservoir, again, we have Route 6 and Willimantic and parts of Mansfield, where it's more densely developed. Impervious cover has the potential to produce or increase the amount of pollutants that run off from the land if that water is not intercepted and infiltrated in the ground and filtered or treated in some fashion. So we have sand if roads are treated with sand in winter as a winter road treatment. We have fluids and toxic chemicals that are coming from motor vehicles that drip and shed these things on our road surfaces that run off when it rains. We have pathogens that accumulate on these surfaces, either from pet waste or I included failing septic systems, which is not from impervious cover, but from urban areas. These are things that are of concern. Nutrients and mercury actually fall from the sky. They're transported through wind currents. They settle on our impervious covers, and then when it rains, they get flushed off in stormwater runoff. Heavy metals are put into roof shingles to keep moss from growing on them. Motor vehicles will shed heavy metals. There's other sources. We often find higher concentrations of these chemicals in soil sediment, the riverine soil sediments near road crossings. And of course, the thermal pollution from those dark impervious surfaces when we have a heavy downpour during summer. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to think about how hot it would be walking barefoot across a parking lot in the summer. Well, that same heat that your feet can feel will get picked up with stormwater runoff and create a pulse of heated stormwater runoff in our streams, which stresses the organisms that live there. And of course, remember that the impervious cover will prevent stormwater from soaking into the ground, which is critically important for recharging our groundwater, which we use as a drinking water supply, and it's also the source of flow in dry periods. Current water quality conditions in the watershed, again, I said it wasn't pristine, but it's not the worst map I've ever seen. In our watershed, we do have higher levels of pathogens measured by E. coli in the Mount Hope River. It's high enough to not meet our water quality standards, but it's not like I would see in an urban area. The background is just too high on a regular basis. We don't know the source, but we have been working to remediate those things through the district doing programs. We put in a llama manure storage facility. So we moved llama manure away from the brook and covered it so rain wouldn't flow through it. And we've also done a stormwater project at a commercial residential apartment complex where a lot of runoff was affecting the brook. And there's more additional opportunities that we'll be looking into in the future. The Natchaug River also is showing up as impaired. This was the report that was sent to Congress. DEEP is required to do every 2 years. The Natchaug River had elevated levels of E. coli in it, but the good news is the levels have been trending downward enough so that that impairment will be lifted in the 2020 report that's being prepared for Congress. So that's a good thing. We do see down below the Willimantic Reservoir, Sawmill Brook, but again, ECCD wrote a watershed plan to deal with that. But otherwise, we have generally good water quality where it's been tested. This map is a lot friendlier. It shows aquatic habitat conditions. This has been assessed by DEEP using multiple methods. You can use the traditional chemical physical attributes, which you have to do frequently to get enough data to make an assessment. They looked at dissolved oxygen, pH, temperature, salinity, toxic metals, nutrients, organic pollutants, and all those other things. But what's really nice is that DEP is working to move away from that type of monitoring to using indicator organisms for stream health. So they are using fish populations in certain circumstances to identify cold water habitat. And in our watershed, we have 2 cold water fish species that are used as indicators, native brook trout and the slimy sculpin. And where you find those fish in abundance, you know that you have to have cold water habitat, and it has to be meeting aquatic life support criteria. They also have a program that uses insects that live underwater. There are certain insects like mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies. They spend the majority of their life cycle underwater, and they only turn to adults long enough to breed, lay their eggs, and then die, and then go back to having an underwater life phase. Some of these macroinvertebrates are pollution sensitive, and you won't find them in water that's contaminated or too warm, too much sediment. So there are pollution indicator species. And there's been a lot of involvement with volunteer monitoring, and I work with those volunteers, where we've been documenting healthy stream conditions using these bugs. And DEP is also working on a program using diatom diversity. Diatoms are a type of algae, single cell algae. Certain types only live where there's low amounts of phosphorus. So they can use this, just do one sample, looking at the diatom diversity to determine if the phosphorus levels are high or low in a stream. Great things we can do, but we're seeing that we have good habitat conditions for aquatic organisms in this watershed. This is another project DEEP has been doing, and with the assistance of volunteers and their own staff, temperature data monitoring, and they're looking for cold water habitat. And cold water habitat is water that's below like 65 degrees in the summer months when the air temperature is high. And they're also looking to determine cold water habitat if there's brook trout and slimy sculpin in the water. And all the dots are places where they've monitored, and all the blue areas around the dots are the watersheds that flow to where the dots were. And you can see, sorry that I can't do a watershed outline on this. I snipped it off their website, and I want to get a better map in the future. Here's the Natchaug River. This is Still River here, Bigelow Brook, Mount Hope River going up here, and this is the Fenton. So you see the Fenton is showing signs of being cold water habitat. And Mount Hope is too warm to meet that criteria until you get up into Ashford. And the Natchaug River is also too warm to support our cold water fish. But if you look at these dots along the river, that indicates that if the fish in the summer can't survive in the main stem river, they have an opportunity to go upstream and use the colder water habitat as a refuge during the summer months, as long as they can get there. And I'll explain what that means. So in the Fenton River, where it's all cold water habitat, it shouldn't surprise you, it's a special trout area designated by DEEP fisheries. That means that there's wild trout living in those areas, and they will not use brown or rainbow trout to stock those streams for anglers. The Natchaug River, where it's too warm for the native trout, they will stock it, and they'll use larger fish raised at the hatchery for recreational fishing. So brown trout and rainbow trout will be used in these areas because the brook trout will be stressed out in those areas. In general, they use a scale, a fish scale. Cold water habitat is what's needed to support brook trout and slimy sculpin. These are different types of warm water fish, including bass, sunfish, and catfish. I'm not suggesting that warm water fish are bad fish. I'm just saying that under normal natural conditions where we didn't have our streams warming up from runoff, we would probably have more cold water habitat. But in your lakes and ponds, you're going to see these other fish in predominance. You're not going to find the cold water fish. And then there's some transitional fish in between. Stream flow. 2011, the state enacted stream flow regulations. DEP went out and classified all the streams on what the stream flow should be. And you see that there's dark green mostly on the streams in the Natchaug watershed with few exceptions. That means they want these streams to be free-flowing streams, no hold and release dams. That doesn't mean that water can't free flow over a dam. You just can't do a hold and release dam, because you don't want to have a lot of water diversions, either taking water out of the stream or taking water from the ground near a stream. Class 2, we have some areas in chartreuse that are minimally altered, and you're going to see some Class 3 areas. Down here in this urbanized area, these streams are moderately impacted because of all the impervious cover. And this one area here in Mansfield and Willington is a moderately altered stream flow, and that's where UConn's Benton River well field is located. There have been issues in the past where human error allowed for too much water to be drawn out of the ground under the Benton River, drawing the water table down below the stream bottom, drying out a large segment of the stream. A lot has happened since then to prevent that from ever happening again. And I've been assured by DEP, they're watching it carefully, including installing trail cameras pointing at the river so they can monitor the flow of the river by looking at pictures without having people having to go out there on a routine basis. And there's a flow gauge downstream that's managed by the USGS, sponsored by UConn, to make sure there's always flow downstream of that area. And UConn's done a lot of conservation practices so that they will never have that kind of demand. And it's tough in a year like this where we haven't had rain, but they're doing the best they can, and they're being watched. So we have cold water habitat, but is that habitat continuous or is it fragmented? And the map that I'm showing on the left is every registered dam that DEP knows about. And those dams do fragment our cold water habitat. As you recall, in the Fenton River, we had a lot of cold water habitat, and you see dams. Well, we don't have salmon here, we have trout, and trout don't leap over those dams. And I can't talk about this issue without the big elephant in the room, and that's the Mansfield Hollow flood control dam that separates the upper part of the Natchaug from the rest of the watershed. Water can leave, but things are not as easy to return upstream if they've ever been eliminated. So this is a barrier to fish passage, and I don't know of any plans to ever change that. So we have a habitat that's kind of isolated here, and whatever we have to make sure we keep in good shape. So the DEP dams are registered on this map. I know for a fact that not all dams that are out there are registered with DEP, because I do pond reviews for citizens on request. And sometimes I go out to a place and there's a dam and it's not on the list that DEP knows about. I'm not talking about beaver dams, they're another issue. But dams frequently fragment stream habitat, and we can take a look at dams to see if their functionality is still needed, if they're relics from a bygone era and look for opportunities to open up stream corridors to larger contiguous patterns by looking at dams that may be better, a better service to be removed. And that includes hazard dams that we don't know about. Private dams that are not registered. I've seen many cases where an earthen dam is in place and the person asks me to look at their pond and there'll be a mature tree growing out of the dam. And anybody knows when a tree blows over, it can take its roots with it. If that tree root is part of the infrastructure of that dam, it falling over will breach the dam and water will be released downstream. That is a hazard to anybody living downstream. We also have road culverts because our roads cross rivers and streams. And I'm not saying road culverts are a bad thing. It's just they can be designed to have less impact on stream continuity. So in 2008, DEP Fisheries came out with stream crossing guidelines. Their preferred design would be clear span bridges and bottomless arch culverts where the bottom substrate is natural to the stream. We have common stream crossing problems that have been documented. This is called a perched culvert. This is when you have water flowing through the stream, and these types of culverts, they're often undersized for heavy rain events. And when the water comes out, it comes out with the force of a fire hose, creates a turbulence down on the downstream side, which erodes the stream bed, and you can literally move boulders with the force of water. And as you can see, when they put this culvert in, they likely put it in even with the stream bottom, but over time it eroded that stream bottom away. So this is a perched culvert, and that fragments our cold water habitat. This one is too shallow, so fish can't swim through there unless they go on their side, but we don't have flounder in our freshwater environments. Water velocity barriers. Again, we're not talking about salmon that can go up waterfalls. We have fish that cannot swim up this current, and if the design of the culvert does not suit the fish and their movement, that is a barrier. And you can have debris accumulate on the upstream side of a culvert, and when that happens again, it's as much as putting in a dam. This map that I showed you indicates where culverts have been surveyed. There is a database available. This was done by the vision of Neil Hagstrom before he retired from fisheries. This database is available. It needs to be used so we can prioritize where culverts are fragmenting cold water habitat and then look at a way to open up more habitat. And if we do this in concert with our flood hazard mitigation plans that our towns are required to do, share this data with our Department of Public Works as they're looking for flood zones. We can replace these culverts with culverts that are better designed to suit both volume of water and the fish that live in those waters. So on to the plan. Again, I reviewed the focus areas within the watershed, and I looked for opportunities to preserve and restore those characteristics to the healthy watershed level. And I came up with action strategies to achieve those goals. I will be repeating several concepts because they overlap. So when I put this plan together in the end, I will be consolidating sections. At this point, though, they're listed as separate issues. And here we go. And they're done in alphabetical order. That way I made sure I covered everything. So agriculture. It's not a dominant feature in the watershed, but it can be a very impactful part, both because it adds to the rural character of our region, it adds to our local economic structure, but it has a high potential to cause water quality degradation. So we have infrastructure in place, human infrastructure in place, to help with our agriculture concerns, the stressors. 5 of the towns have agriculture commissions, and these agriculture commissions can be a valuable tool for communicating with our ag producers about the goals of the Natchaug Healthy Watershed Implementation Plan, or whatever its final title is. Developing a fact sheet, distributing it. There is an existing partnership for assistance on agricultural waste management systems. This is a partnership between the Department of Ag, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, Yukon Extension System, and the Conservation District. Working together, we can reach out to agricultural producers that have ag waste issues and assist them to find funding to correct those issues. And this has worked very well in other watersheds, but I'm not as familiar with this type of project being done in the Natchaug watershed. The next watershed over, Little River, Woodstock, and Putnam. This has been a very successful model on how to assist our ag producers. Farmers markets, farmers are able to stay profitable, they'll be able to stay in agriculture. These farmers markets are a great way for farmer producers to support the local customer client base and support their agricultural, their farms. And these farmer markets can be a way to do outreach to the farmers about our Healthy Watershed Plan and get information to them with the development of a fact sheet about the key issues that we're trying to reach, outreach to them on. There is an existing outreach program called the Connecticut Advocate, and the Advocate is currently not funded to do any work on outreach in this project, but in the future, if we can find funding, this is a trusted individual, worked with all the towns that created agricultural commissions. She's a known person. We can use this position to do outreach to farms on available funding assistance for them to do conservation practices. And in the end, I'd like to see an agriculture working group develop for the Natchaug watershed that is got representation from all the towns and other professionals and stakeholders in the agricultural community working together to look at ways to reduce impacts of agriculture on the water quality and habitat quality in the Natchaug River. Climate resiliency. This is something I can't emphasize enough. We are in a changing time. I had the privilege of sitting through a presentation by Dr. Valley, who is the National Weather Service Northeast River Forecast Center Director. And in his presentation, he made it very clear the patterns are changing. We have increasing annual precipitation. We have increasing frequency of heavy rains. We have warming annual temperatures. And we have wildly varying seasonal snowfall. These are all parameters that can be measured and charted, and these are changes that we're seeing. They're trends that we're seeing over time. And we do need to be thinking about climate resiliency in a healthy watershed, because the conditions that we have now are predicted to be different 50 years from now. One of the issues that I have of concern is flood risks. I was looking for, all right, we'll step back. Windham County is the only county in Connecticut where the flood risk maps, the flood insurance rate maps, have not been digitized, so you can use them in GIS, and that frustrates me. That's to the side. But those flood risk maps are now being redeveloped because of the changes that are going on. So we're probably a long way off and a low priority because of low population in this area to have any new maps being made. But it is important for municipal leaders and the Public Works Department to catalog local knowledge of for flood-prone areas that may not be reflected on the old firm maps, and make sure that those areas are cataloged and used in the updates of the hazard mitigation plans that each town is required to update every so many years. We have an opportunity to use aerial imagery to look for unregistered dams. That way, I'm worried about those unregistered dams because they're neglected often up in the woods. They can hold water back. They're not being maintained. During one of the heavy rain events, they could breach. If there's a series of them in a location, one breach can cause a cascading effect, and then you end up with a large surge of floodwater that was unexpected because it was unknown that these dams were there because you can't see them from the road. And I was approached in 2005 after we had the flood in northeastern Connecticut by the emergency manager's coordinator to ask me if I knew where there might have been any dams. He was looking for funding to pay for some of the damage that happened in my town, and thought perhaps that could have been a contributor to that flooding that occurred. I didn't have a way to look at it then, but now we have much better tools to do that, and it's just going to take some time to go through going up the rivers, looking for wider areas in the river, and then ground truthing that information with property owner permission, with property owners fully understanding if that dam breaches, they could be liable for downstream damages. We can utilize existing resources to educate forest landowners on forest management with climate resiliency as something they need to be thinking about. If it gets warmer, our trees are the most suitable for surviving in a warmer climate. What pests could be introduced that weren't able to survive overwinter here before that could come in. I went to a great program given by Mark Ashton at Yale Forest about this. There's tools we have available and just need to be utilizing the tools we have. We have Yale Forest has a Quiet Corner initiative to do outreach to forest managers and to the local citizens on issues such as this. And the fourth one is for municipalities, local municipalities, to focus on drought management plans. I'm sure the Willimantic Waterworks has a drought management plan because they're required to as a public utility, but where we have the majority of people in the watershed getting water from private wells, we still have drought issues, and we should have a plan to deal with that. And I wrote this into my plan before I got the email from our town administrator saying, who do you think would make a good drought management coordinator for our town? I told him somebody else, but I will support that effort. And it's really great to hear that it is something that's being seriously considered. And I believe I got the original idea for this by going through a hazard mitigation plan that was put together by Natchaug. In terms of resiliency, this is a map that was put together by the Nature Conservancy, and it shows areas of the watershed that under their model are above average, slightly above, far above average for climate resiliency. Shows some areas in brown that are below average, and the majority of the watershed is average for climate resiliency. So we're not in bad shape, but it is something we need to consider. Commercial and industrial properties. Commercial and industrial properties are often permitted to have higher amounts of impervious cover on their lot. In my town, 50% of a lot is allowed to be covered with impervious cover for industrial properties. And that's a lot of stormwater runoff. And these are more likely to be facilities that store hazardous materials, and spill management needs to be considered to manage if there's a spill. Parking lot, sidewalk housekeeping, making sure they keep these areas swept so that any runoff is not loaded with sand and salt or other parking lot contaminants. So that kind of housekeeping is important. If they have dumpsters on the property, they should be following best management practices for dumpsters. And they need to maintain their stormwater infrastructure and BMTPs, especially if it's green infrastructure. You can't just put it in and forget about it. There is a maintenance that needs to be done on these infrastructure, that type of infrastructure, and they do need to do that. And so I see opportunities to work with our commercial and industrial property owners to make sure any new development is in compliance with the Stormwater Quality Manual, with the LID, Low Impact Development Appendix. That's up to land use officials as they're reviewing development plans to make sure that they are compliant with that. I've seen an opportunity to develop and share education and outreach materials with business owners. So if they're unaware of what they should be doing, they are educated on that. And that could be a stakeholder team that works on that. Here's the carrot, developing Natchaug certificate program for these property owners, that if they do something they're not required to retrofit a stormwater issue, they get awarded for it with recognition, which is good publicity for them. So they're more likely to be doing this as opposed to being told you have to do it. Inventory brownfields. I went and did some research on where brownfields might be in the watershed, and I didn't see very many registered brownfields, and it could be that there are brownfields that aren't registered. Brownfields are eligible for some assistance in getting cleaned up, and it's always better to take a used industrial facility that's not being used now and reuse it than it is to take out forests and put in a new facility. So having a brownfield registration, so we know about it, getting registered with DEP and working with those landowners to upgrade those properties would be good. And then this is something anybody can do starting anytime. It doesn't need to be my plan, but when DEP is going to approve a permit, there's a period of time before that permit is approved. They put it out for public comment, and oftentimes they're reviewing the permit based on the information they have, and there may be information you have that they don't know about. So if you go and sign up to be on the DEP e-alert system, then you can be notified, and if something's in your neighborhood, you can add comment to that, which may impact how that permit is approved or not. This is my leaking dumpster that somebody put in some kind of petrochemical device, and it was leaking on the sidewalk down into a brook. So dumpsters are a big issue if they're not maintained properly. Floodplain protection. This is a very high value resource. It's habitat, fish and wildlife, provides flood and erosion control, surface water quality is maintained through floodplain protection, recharges groundwater, recreational opportunities, great assets to our floodplains. We need to make sure these floodplains are not interrupted. So we want to look at these floodplains, if there's any unregistered dams, to include those in your hazard mitigation plan so we don't have more flooded areas, and incorporate frequently flooded areas into your hazard mitigation plan as well. And you can also come up with regulations about, if there are regulations about what can be done and can't be done on floodplains. Different towns do it differently. This is from Mansfield. This is their zoning regulations. And these areas in blue, this is Mansfield Hollow Lake. And this is the this is Mount Hope River. This is the Fenton River. And down here is the Natchaug River. Their floodplains are an actual flood hazard zone. And they're very strict about enforcing what types of activities can happen in that flood hazard zone. And you might be able to put in a shed, but there's like a you're not going to build a house in there, because they recognize that is an issue, and preventing people from being in harm's way is a good thing. And this is how they're dealing with it. Forest conservation is critically important in this watershed. Our core forest areas are providing those environmental services I've already gone over. So we need to do education and outreach to municipalities and landowners on the impacts of our forests and fragmentation of our forests. We want to promote education on wildlife and invasive species management because they impact how our forests are, the health of our forests. And we want to promote forest management planning. So people who own forests recognize that unless they're putting effort into managing the forests for invasive species or for wildlife habitat or for timber harvest, whatever, leaving it to nature is not a good strategy. So we want to promote forest management planning for healthy forests. That's our friendly Eric, one of our foresters that I've worked with, been very familiar with. Groundwater is an incredibly important resource that is underappreciated. Most residents and businesses upstream of Mansfield Hollow Lake get their drinking water from the ground, from private wells. We really don't have any good locational records for where these wells are located. Groundwater is the source of water flow during rivers when it's dry, during dry periods. So we have an opportunity to cooperate with the State Water Plan Private Well Work Group as part of the State Water Plan to help them to develop a private well database. This database will be useful for a lot of reasons. We can look for patterns of wells that are drying up and look for our ability to notify people if there's a spill and they may be at risk so they can get their water tested. This is a really important tool that will be needed, and it's an ongoing effort, and it's something we should cooperate with. And again, work with the COGS on the development of local drought response plans. Can't say that enough is important. This is last week's drought monitor, and you can see that as of last Thursday, we were in a severe drought in this region. And yes, it is impacting water flow in our local streams. I've seen a lot of headwater streams that are dried up this year because of the drought. So we shouldn't be watering our lawns if it's taking water out of the ground and mostly putting it back into the atmosphere. Cold water stream habitat. This is a resource that's in decline in the entire state of Connecticut. We're rich with it here, but these upland headwater streams are more vulnerable to disturbance. When you put impervious cover, you increase stormwater runoff that could be heated and carry contaminants that impact these streams, and it will reduce the amount of groundwater recharge so that it impacts the stream flow during dry periods. And this habitat that's been documented can be fragmented by dams and culverts. So we want to continue to inventory, and as a person who coordinates that type of work with the volunteers at the Last Green Valley, we do see opportunities to go out and document more cold water habitat through our water quality monitoring program. We can do a review of the existing road culvert survey data to look for those fish passage barriers so we can begin to plan to open up those stream miles. We can promote this database, the cold water stream database, to the Department of Public Works and residents so they can make informed decisions. There is a list of 10 things you can do in your yard to support cold water habitat that I put up on our social media account. And we can turn that into an outreach fact sheet for people to download and become familiar with. This cold water stream habitat database should be used in land use change decisions, especially for inland wetlands where temperature is a physical characteristic of the water quality that can be impaired by development too close to the cold water streams, or removing the tree canopy, or all the other different things that can happen as a result of development. We can, again, focus on unregistered dams because those dams are also impacting continuity of that habitat. And we can look for other stressors on these things using aerial map resources. Well, this is some of the critters you might find in the stream. Most people aren't so fond of these things, but these are mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies. I pulled out a Bevington Brook in Ashford, which indicates good water quality at that location. And this was just 5 minutes, I found these bugs that I know to be healthy indicators of water quality. Invasive species. We have a number of invasive species, whether it's insects, fungus, plants, animals, that impact our local habitat quality and water quality. So awareness and management of these species is going to be an ongoing effort. I put up some plant species that are common, but we also have issues with invasive aquatic plants. We have insects that are impacting our forest health, emerald ash borer, woolly adelgid on hemlocks, and of course we just went through a major gypsy moth outbreak that had an impact on the health of our oak forests. But there are programs that we can utilize for invasive species awareness, especially for plant species. People become more aware and then can start to tackle the problem and not just give up. Lakes and ponds. We have some wonderful lakes and ponds in this watershed, and they benefit everybody in the community, whether they're private lakes and ponds or ones with public access. I am concerned, though, about compacted development around some of the private lakes that may increase the potential for stressors on those aquatic systems. Nutrient enrichment is the primary concern. And also, if you have early intervention, if an aquatic invasive species is introduced, that can be really important to get it before it spreads. So for lake and pond residents, I warn you that pollution prevention begins at home, and I have a complete list of things I recommend for lake and pond shore residents on things they should be doing, especially when it comes to maintaining their septic systems. It's one of the things that I most worry about is these lakes and ponds that have these communities that they were built in the 1980s, I think. A lot of the ones that we have around here, starting out as summer cottages, and now they're year-round homes. And a septic system has a 30-year life expectancy. So I will say it out loud. You need to plan to fail. And you need to make sure you leave land on your lot where you can put in another new septic system when your system fails. Ignoring your septic system will degrade the water quality in the lake, which will reduce your property values. So this is something that has to be addressed. We need to continue to promote education on lake-specific issues, and there's some great organizations that do that. There's the Connecticut Federation of Lakes. There's the National Association of Lake Managers Society, the New England chapter, that does a program every year. And there's also a program in Massachusetts, the Coalition of Lakes and Ponds, that they don't mind if you cross the border and come listen to their workshops as well. Education will make better decision makers. And we have to look at Mansfield Hollow Flood Control Project, aka Lake, as an indicator of health of this watershed. Because if you have 64 square miles of drainage going into this lake, if that lake starts to change, that's an indication of changes upstream. And there's very little water quality data from this lake. It's not being managed as a recreational lake. It is a flood control project. But there is some baseline data that we could obtain. Here's Gary, volunteer help in mail this year. He was out doing SECIDIS monitoring, which is a measure of water clarity. Glad to report that Mansfield Hollow Lake was reading in a moderately eutrophied lake. It's not in bad shape at all right now, so that's a good thing. But we can continue to get data on this lake and look for trends. Lawns and turf grass. Lawns and turf grass is an American obsession. And I understand that the turf grass industry, the lawn care industry in particular, is a tremendous contributor to our local economy. There's a lot of entrepreneurs that make their living maintaining people's lawns. So I don't want to take away their ability to have an income. And I'm not saying have no lawns, because I have a lawn. I'm not going to be a hypocrite. However, the environmental benefits of turf grass is very low. It may prevent erosion, but it really doesn't have very much other environmental benefit. Lawn irrigation systems. for grasses that are not native to this region place a very high demand on our water resources. And runoff from chemically treated lawns, whether they're treated with fertilizers or pesticides, is harmful to the aquatic environment. And you can just flip the bag over and see the warning label if you read that far and all that fine print. It's hazardous to fish and the other aquatic, especially grub killers. They'll also kill those macroinvertebrates that I had shown in my hand. And we also have an issue unrelated to the aquatic environment, and that we have a decline nationally in pollinator species because of unknown pressures, undefined pressures. So we can take all this information and turn it into opportunities. So we can educate people on the benefits of reducing their lawn sizes. There's many environmental benefits to doing that. But for the people in the lawn care industry, we can offer vocational retraining. So instead of mowing lawns, perhaps teach them how to plant a meadow, which still gives you that openness feeling if you like looking at the vast landscape, but in a more environmentally friendly way. And it does take a skilled person to establish a meadow grass that's a more appropriate native species composition and increasing habitat potential of the same land where the lawn is pretty much sterile. This is a favorite project of mine, is to promote voluntary participation in what is known as the Pollinator Pathway Initiative. This is not my original idea, but there's one that I brought to my town. Pollinators, you're very familiar with monarchs migrating long distances. We have other butterflies that also migrate, but we want to make sure we keep healthy pollinator habitat. That pollinator habitat supports the pollinators that pollinate our vegetables and fruit crops. And we can do this by learning to value native plants and grasses over some of the landscape choices that we're making that are not native to this area and not necessarily as friendly to our pollinator species. When we use native plants and grasses, they do not have the same water requirements because they tend to be deeper rooted and they allow for better groundwater recharge. They provide pollinator habitat, and they don't need to be fertilized, and you don't use pesticides on native plantings if you want to support pollinators. As a side effect of changing our behaviors in our yards, even just patches of our yard, we're putting less environmental pollutants into the landscape that will run off. And if we put our pollinator gardens in a rain garden that also encourages water to soak into the ground, we're doing multiple benefits just by how we do our landscaping. And the final opportunity is, a really big, dream, is to change people's attitudes about where they live. I would like to see this area as rebranded as a homegrown national park. Now, if anybody likes to go to national parks, you go there to see the wildlife, you go there to see the unique biota they have there, the plants, the geographic features. We have all that here, but we can increase the diversity of plants and animals in our own environment and do this and think of our land as a national park. And what better place to do that is here in the last Green Valley National Heritage Corridor, which is designated by Congress to be a place of similar natural resource conditions and cultural heritage. So we already have the ability to transform our thinking and support the idea of making this a homegrown national park for our enjoyment, not necessarily for anybody else, but for our own personal enjoyment, knowing we're doing the right thing. And the last Green Valley is also planning to promote pollinators in their next magazine that's coming out in the spring. So the steps are already there for us to just jump on that. So I want to just bring that up. The Pollinator Pathway does have a logo, and who doesn't want to see this type of thing in their landscape? We have municipal land use regulations, and the commissions that the people, volunteers that serve on them, make informed decisions. So there's a lot of different training programs available to these commissioners that they can take advantage of to allow them to do their job more effectively. UConn has the Center for Land Use Education resources. They have programs that they will do on request, and many of them are online. The Non-Point Education Municipal Officials also has programs that you can view online or have a speaker come when we can get together again. The Association of Connecticut Association of Conservation and Wetland Commissions is a great annual program to teach wetlands and conservation commissions about issues, and DEEP has training videos for wetlands officials. So we really should be encouraging our land use officials to take advantage of these existing training programs. I know when I first became involved in my town, at that time the Green Valley Institute existed. That's a partnership between UConn Extension Service and the last Green Valley. And the educators really helped to teach me about local issues on conservation. And I call myself a graduate of the Green Valley Institute from the mentorship of those programs. But there's other programs available. We just need to coordinate and recycle these programs so that more people have opportunities to see them. And as a final product of this project, when I'm under contractual obligation to develop, and it's in progress, is to develop a Natchaug Healthy Watershed Development Review Checklist. This checklist will be distributed to people who are, the goal is to have it distributed to people who are proposing land use changes in the watershed, and they can compare their plans to be compatible with the goals of our Natchaug Healthy Watershed Plan. So there'll be scores like, if there's a stream on here, how wide is the riparian buffer, the undisturbed zone? Are you compliant with health code requirements for separating distances between the rivers and your septic system, which in a drinking water watershed is 50 feet? Is your stormwater detention areas 50 feet away from your leaching field, because you don't want to hydraulically overload those systems? And if it's a commercial property, it's a greater distance. People may be violating these codes because they aren't aware of them. So we have this checklist that's distributed. People can check the boxes. You get a scorecard that becomes part of the application process. And then if there are some issues that are discovered, it's kind of pointed out when this checklist is handed in. We have municipal tools that can be used to encourage land conservation. We can use tax policies, such as tax abatements on farm equipment, or we can use the 490 program, which gives you a reduction in your real estate taxes based on how you use your land rather than its real estate value. And this way, we can encourage unbuilt land to remain unbuilt. And we can also use existing conservation subdivision regulations to protect our natural resources as an open space set-aside requirement. So the tax policies that I'm talking about in the PA 490 program, there are different categories for PA 490. There's an agricultural PA 490 where you get taxed on what kinds of crops you're planting on that land, and it has to be land that's actively used in agriculture. There's a forestry category. So for forested lands over 25 acres, and could be multiple parcels, at least as long as each parcel is more than 10 acres, you get a tax break if you don't develop that land. But for the forestry one, you have to have some kind of a forest plan developed on how you're managing that land as well. There's also a third category called open space, and that's a little bit more open to how you use it, as long as you don't develop the land. And I also would like to see municipalities develop a regional open space plan and use that plan into determining where conservation set-asides could be in the subdivision based on the resources we're trying to protect. For the 490 program, not every town allows the open space designation under the 490 program. Farmland and forests, all the towns allow that. Open space, not so much. This is Woodstock. I think they're the most liberal in terms of who gets to use the 490 program for open space. They get a tax break. And any place that's white, like over here in Northwest Woodstock, well, that's DEP forest land. We have more developed areas down in South Woodstock. But imagine creating an overlay zone if we want to protect those riparian stream buffers. And if you have a stream going through your property and you promise that you sign a commitment that you're not going to develop the land along those stream buffers, you get a tax break. And you can literally encourage people to not develop land where you don't want to develop, and where you want development, you don't give them those tax breaks. And that's a way to control development. Again, that regional open space plan, this is something that we can use the tools we have and carefully think out our conservation strategies and how the open space in this land, we can't save it all, but what's the most important ones? Using the tools we have available, mapping tools and other information, willingness for people to sell their land or development rights or whatever, can be built into this strategy, and then maybe even find a way to begin a conservation fund so that we can help with certain costs associated with open space preservation, like real estate transaction fees or surveyor fees. Where that funding comes from hasn't been determined, but it would be a great asset to have. And thinking on the New York City model, perhaps the people that benefit from the lack of development upstream can help support that conservation upstream because they benefit downstream. And I'm thinking about the users of the drinking water that we protect upstream. So I'd like to effectively do this. I'd like to see that Northeast Mapper project, which is a new project that was a collaboration between Last Green Valley and the Connecticut Trust for Public Lands, to hire GIS specialists to update the open space data layer in northeastern Connecticut. It is the most current open space data layer, but unless there's continuous funding, they can't add new parcels as they are protected. So we need to continue to support projects like that, so we can use it as a tool. Again, working collaboratively with open space committees on the municipal level with our land trust to come up with a regional open space plan will be a benefit. And if it's in the open space plan, you might get more points if you're looking for a grant or some type of foundation funding for preserving a piece of land that's of critical importance. And then explore setting up some kind of a watershed conservation fund. But that would be an open space working group under this plan going forward. We have public access to a lot of places in this watershed. We have fishermen's easements on our rivers where they're stocked with fish. We have public boat launches in our lakes, access to hiking trails that encourage outdoor recreation, and all these things develop and appreciate for our natural resources in the area. Let's get more people outside so they can appreciate the things that they have right in their back door and may not notice. And organized events such as Trails Day, which is organized annually by Connecticut Forests and Parks Association, or other outdoor events like Spring Outdoors in Walktober, which are organized by the Last Green Valley, are a great way to promote natural resource conservation in our watershed. I'd like to see more of these types of activities. There is an established Friends of Mansfield Hollow, and we can use the Friends of Mansfield Hollow as a tool to help educate people about the importance of the Natchaug Healthy Watershed Plan, and use them for outreach purposes and getting more people to support the policies in the plan. We could also look to create a new friends group for Bigelow Hollow. Mansfield Hollow is a higher population center. There's more people that live around the lake and care about it. Bigelow Hollow will be a little bit more challenging. The town of Union has a population of under 1,000 people, but there are people who come from far and wide to use that park, and that park can definitely benefit from a friends group, helping them with outreach and other planning issues. We have numerous land trusts that are active in this region, and Everybody has an opportunity to join a land trust, support them with your membership dollars so they can plan their budget, pay their insurance fees or what other expenses they have, mailing expenses so they can do outreach to everybody, and also help them plan so they can continue to do their job of land preservation, because what they do benefits all of us. And again, support the outdoor educational programming opportunities through Last Green Valley and Connecticut Forest and Parks Association. This is where anybody can coordinate a program to educate people about the Natchaug Healthy Watershed and why we care about it so much. And of course, couldn't talk about the Natchaug without showing a fly fisherman. We also need to protect aquifer recharge areas. Where are those aquifer recharge areas is a good question. There are certain aquifer protection areas that are APAs that are designated by DEP. They surround well fields that are supplying over 1,000 people in stratified drift deposits. So they have protected areas around them, and there's land use restrictions of those areas where you're looking at regulated activities to make sure these regulated activities are a higher probability of contaminating these resources, make sure they're properly cited and monitored so they are not creating any potential water quality issues. Obviously, open space over an APA is the best strategy if you can do that. However, the majority of people in this watershed get their water from a private well, and those are not protected by an APA regulation. So understanding how groundwater works, where your groundwater comes from, what your potential risks are, is the responsibility of all the local citizens. And private well owners are also responsible for testing the quality of their own well water. They need to know what to test for. There can be better outreach in this respect. Conservation District did a program this spring about testing your private well. We did record that program. It's available for people to watch. We will be publishing all these different links to our YouTube channel. Watch these programs at their leisure. But it is important to understand about the potential to contaminate drinking water with surface activities. And land use decision makers need to be well informed about groundwater recharge concepts and how to protect us from contaminated sources of pollution. Here's our watershed again. This is snagged off the DEP website. Here's that aquifer protection area. It's in Mansfield and Willington. It's the only one in the Natchaug watershed. And this one is the one that goes under the Fenton River and serves the UConn campus. So that that actually draws water out of our watershed and moves it into the Willimantic watershed as a result. So we also be thinking about that as well. Low impact development strategies. These are ways that you can have development but reduce its impact from runoff. And you can do this on residential land. You can do it on commercial land as well. We have to be thinking about stormwater runoff and the contamination it brings. And we can encourage property owners to change their landscaping practices. I brought that up before. So using educational resources, many of them already existing, we can promote this green landscaping concept where you have a flower garden, but if planting that flower garden in a depression is very helpful, so that we can soak more water into the ground, reduce the amount of contamination running off, and recharge groundwater so that we have plentiful water supplying our streams during drought. We want to protect our wildlife and aquatic habitat, water quality, and with those riparian buffers. So preserving those vegetated strips of land adjacent to water resources is one of the most important things we could do. We have certain wildlife that depends on those riparian areas, and others that use them routinely to move between forested blocks. So promoting education and outreach on the multiple values of this habitat and resource is important. And again, district did an outreach project on this earlier in this grant program, and that's available for people to watch, or we repeat programs if there's a demand for it. We can incentivize riparian conservation by using the PA 490 tax program to reduce taxes for open space in designated areas and discourage development of those areas. And when we're doing open space planning or open space set-asides and subdivisions, we can prioritize those areas for preservation. Here's a couple pictures that I got from Patrick Smith, who did our riparian buffer presentation for wildlife habitat. And there's a diversity of wildlife that uses these areas. And to keep in mind, he's got a camera set up at this log bridge, and this log bridge is used by numerous species of wildlife that are crossing from one side of the brook to the other. And it's important to maintain this because it unfragments habitat when the animals have a means to get across the river. But oftentimes there's a conflict between the use of wildlife and people who want to paddle on those rivers, and they see that as an obstacle. They would rather not portage around, but I want to make people aware of the importance of these log bridges across streams. Road infrastructure is an unnecessary evil we have. We have to be able to get where we need to go, and we drive on roads to get there, but road networks can be a significant threat to water quality. We have some older stormwater infrastructure that is not compliant with our current stormwater regulations. We have health codes that say stormwater outfall should be at least 100 feet away from streams. And in not all cases that's the case. There's some places where they directly discharge into streams. Our road culvert designs fragment stream habitats. We have unpaved roads that have to have special dust management practices that we could benefit from more education and training for our public works departments. And of the 8 towns in the Natchaug watershed, 6 of the towns are exempted from the general permit for separate storm sewer system regulations. So there's not a lot of focus on stormwater runoff in those 6 towns. So we have opportunities. We can work with our local Department of Public Works. We can promote watershed-friendly best management practices and encourage them to retrofit non-compliant stormwater discharge pipes or the culverts that are fragmenting our stream networks. And we could also look at water quality data to see if there's any areas where reduced salt applications might be important because it's protecting sensitive areas. Where did my thing go? Sorry about that. Septic systems. In this watershed, this is a really big issue. Failing, obsolete, and under-maintained septic systems are a potential major stressor to water quality in the Natchaug watershed. There may not be even enforcement of Public Health Code 1913B32 that enforces separating distances between septic systems and water resources. When I talked to people at town halls, I said, why is this not your regulation? And they said, well, it's not our job, it's the health department's job to do that. And then the health department says, well, we have to give a waiver or whatever. You know, they planned it this way, we're going to give them a waiver. We need to be more consistent with enforcement and also with separating distance between stormwater infiltration issues. We need to know, you know, those regulations, and that will be something that gets covered in the checklist. But we also have to think about pet waste differently because it is an environmental pollutant, and dealing with pet waste in certain circumstances, especially in the more urbanized areas, needs to be addressed. So we have the opportunity to create educational information. Again, the district did do a workshop on septic system care and maintenance as part of a different project, but it was concurrent with this one and covered the same communities. Improved record keeping by property owners and the local health department on where these septic systems are located. Prior to the Clean Water Act being passed, there was very limited record keeping on septic system locations. In the 80s, more stringent regulations for septic systems came on board. Health department did start doing some record keeping, but they're not digitized. It's really hard to determine how old a septic system is on a property without doing a lot of research. The records might not exist, or they might be archived someplace and inaccessible. So getting information on septic system locations, age, bear in mind this average septic system has a lifespan of 30 years. So we have to make sure that people are aware and take actions if their septic system is showing signs of failure. Is really critically important. There are financial assistance programs for residential property owners that meet income eligibility requirements. Those opportunities need to be continued. So if there is a need to replace a septic system, which is not inexpensive, it's 5 figures or more, they can do this with a low interest loan or 0 interest loan in some cases, or maybe even as a lien on their property, because it's important to take care of this issue. And then, of course, pet waste. There needs to be improved education, outreach, behavior change on behalf of people. We're watching on a local social media group where someone was complaining about the person who cleans up their pet waste in a plastic bag, but leaves that plastic bag on the side of the road. I don't think they get the point, but well, there has to be improved education on that. And of course, septic systems, there's a lot of reasons you don't want your septic system to fail. Stormwater management, significant source of water pollution. We want to assist those towns that are MS4 towns, like Mansfield and Millington. So there are educational and outreach programs available to them. There's an Eastern Connecticut Stormwater Collaborative where they can go and get ideas, share ideas, sometimes share equipment to be compliant with the MS4 requirements. And the non-point education for municipal official programs has an MS4 coordinator to assist towns with their concerns about becoming compliant. So there's a lot of tools out there. We just got to make sure people are aware of and taking advantage of them. And we also in the future are going to need to collaborate with the DOT, the Connecticut DOT, for future Natchaug implementation efforts. They were invited to all our meetings. They did not send a representative, and I would like to see them be a participant in maintaining the health of this watershed in the future. And here's an example. This is not from the watershed, but if we have a stormwater pipe that's directly discharging upstream of the Willimantic Reservoir, that's an opportunity to retrofit that to reduce that impact from that direct discharge. Habitat continuity, this is something I'm repeating. We don't want to interrupt our stream flow from human activities. Dams and culverts fragment that habitat. So we want to make sure we do enough education and outreach on these programs. There are existing Department of Energy and Environmental Protection programs that we can take advantage of. We just need to coordinate this education outreach programming. There's an existing culvert survey. We can use it to find out where—
Excuse me, Jean?
Yes?
I think you lost your screen. You're sharing.
Just now?
5 minutes ago, maybe, but I wasn't sure if it was just me, but someone else just said that they lost it too. So I'm assuming everyone lost it.
I concur.
I cannot figure out how to get it back. I'm gonna end the show. Go to here. Zoom meeting.
It's because the meeting was scheduled from 10 to noon, and at noon it cut out.
Can you see it now?
Yes, it's back, but it's your screenshot from your laptop. It's got the whole PowerPoint set up.
Well, that's because I had two. I can go back. How's that?
It cut out at septic systems, but I heard the audio. The audio was fine.
Okay. So this is septic systems, stormwater management, stream habitat continuity, education and outreach, working with the DOT, getting people to communicate about this issue and coming up with a plan to understand where the fragmentation is occurring, and then developing plans to restore it, especially in our cold water stream habitat. Little joke. Wetlands and water resources, very important for a lot of reasons, a lot of environmental benefits to preserving these resources. We want to make sure that we have the training resources for people who serve on our wetland commissions so that they are able to review developments to really look for impacts for the physical characteristics of these watersheds. And what's really great is DEEP has made the training program available online so that people can look at these training programs at their convenience as opposed to trying to meet someone's schedule. So there's no excuse for wetland officials to not go through the training. That's a great change. And they also have training for the aquifer protection area oversight boards. And the towns need to use their regulatory authority to really look at the physical characteristics of that water resources and how potential land uses can impact it. And we can also be looking at prioritizing land acquisition that protects these resources as well. Preserving wildlife corridors, whether they're big ones or small ones, the riparian corridors or the pollinator pathway initiative. This is going to take education, outreach, social marketing to get people to understand their value and have them change their behaviors. So we want to encourage people to participate. We cannot force them to participate. So that is something that's going to take a coordinated effort, and we can expand on the existing pollinator pathway initiative, which has been brought to the town of Woodstock, and we're looking to expand out from there. Again, here's that habitat continuity, and pollinator pathways would be perfect in these brown regions to create habitat connectivity. Woodlands, and I will combine this with forest in the future, but I separated out woodlands because people who own smaller patches of wooded property don't think of them as a forest, they think of them as the woods in their backyard. So we have to call them woods because that's how they're thought about. I pulled up this segment of the core forest blocks because I recognize this feature. This is Ashford Lake. So you see, here's Ashford Lake. Here's the lakefront community on the eastern shore of the lake. And then you see these two forested blocks that are on the eastern side. And this is the map from the parcel map with the aerial group view underneath it. And you can see that we have this part of the core forest here, and this is this piece in here. So we have these core forest blocks, but the yellow lines indicate that this core forest block has multiple owners. So it's really hard for smaller wooded land owners to think of them as being part of a larger forested piece. And that's going to take education and outreach. These are not people who are going to benefit from the PA 490 forest land protection program. But if you look at this blue line going through here, that's Bigelow Brook. And that's a pretty important resource in this watershed. So in this case, protecting the riparian lands along here by allowing people to use the PA 490 open space designation could potentially protect this forest block from being fragmented further. This is the final slide. We are never going to accomplish anything with this plan unless we take the next step, and that's to create a Natchaug Healthy Watershed Advisory Board. So once the plan is completed and gone through all the approval processes and it's adopted, the next important step is going to be implementation. And I'm recommending that we have an advisory board that's made up of representatives from the 8 watershed communities and other project stakeholders and professionals as they're available to help facilitate the implementation of this plan and achieve the goals. And within the advisory board will be working groups focused on specific topics, whether it's looking at those road culverts. We can have a group of people who say, I'll take this on, and then they'll report back to the advisory board So not one person is going to be responsible for doing everything, but we're going to divvy up the responsibility between the communities, and in the overall end picture, have a means to achieve our goals and keep the watershed healthy. So we have an opportunity for the municipalities to show how willing they are to work cooperatively. First, we're going to ask them to sign an intermunicipal agreement to adopt the plan. And then we're going to ask them to reference the plan in their local plans of conservation and development. We're going to ask for communities to send representatives to serve on the advisory board. And then, you know, as any advisory board, all their activities will be noted and publicly available. There'll be complete transparency. But as they're going forward, we're going to need cooperation between the towns to share resources and share educational outreach ideas, as we're trying to get people to think about their personal behaviors, which in the long run is what's going to be the making the watershed remain healthy or have it degrade. So that advisory board is one of the more critical pieces. Having the plan, like Tracy said at the beginning, sitting on a shelf does nobody a service.